Thank you for coming. My name is Michael Pigg. I want to talk to you this morning a little bit about implementing continuous delivery on Jenkins with a application that's architected with microservices style. First of all, I want to give you a little background about where I'm coming from. I work for a consulting company called Chariot Solutions. And my focus right now mainly is on helping clients learn new technologies like Scala or AngularJS. But I also help clients solve problems that they have. And I had an opportunity to implement a continuous delivery pipeline for a client. And so this talk is my experiences, what I learned from doing that implementation. So I think everybody here is interested in doing continuous delivery probably, or is already doing it. And we might have slightly different definitions about what continuous delivery means. But a couple of things that stood out to me when I was learning about and working on implementing continuous delivery was that this gives you the ability to release software anytime. And at least the way that I'm approaching continuous delivery, that any build that we do could potentially be a release build. And so this has some impacts in how we set up our continuous delivery pipeline. Primarily, one of the impacts is around versioning. How do we version the software? And so we'll see that a little bit later in the talk. Also, this concept that we want to build the artifacts once and then deploy them as we need. So again, any build is going to produce artifacts. It could end up being artifacts that get deployed to production. And usually we think of a delivery pipeline continuous delivery in terms of a pipeline. And so that pipeline encompasses all the steps that are required to get the software into production. So for my purposes, it starts with a change committed into SCM and then ends with a build deployed to production if all goes well. A particular pipeline could end earlier than that if it doesn't pass all of the quality criteria to make it all the way into production. And for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to think of my pipeline as starting with a commit made on whatever our development branch is, so maybe the master branch. Jenkins is going to build the project and run tests and package the artifacts, store them off for deployment somewhere. Then we'll do a deploy to a test environment and a deploy to a production environment. So obviously, this is quite a bit simplified from what you might do in the real world. But I think the concepts are still applicable. Now, so continuous delivery is a great approach. What happens when we layer on top of that microservices architecture? So it's pretty popular in the development community right now to be developing applications as a microservices architecture. The key things about that, as opposed to developing an application where all of the services are contained in one monolithic application that you deploy, we're going to instead, in the microservices architecture, build our application as a set of collaborating services that will deliver the overall application functionality. Often this is modeled around business concepts. And the really key thing is that it gives us the ability to deploy and scale different parts of the application as are appropriate to that part of the application. So a part that can be serviced by being deployed to one server can be deployed that way. A part that can be serviced or that requires maybe 10 servers to handle its load can be deployed appropriately. But when we combine these two things together, the continuous delivery and the microservices architecture, we end up with more of everything in the Jenkins world. More code repositories. We typically have a separate code, SCM repository for each of the microservices. Of course, more builds, more deployments that need to be done. And so we need to have some tools that help us deal with this explosion of jobs. And so the way that I'm going to talk about doing it today in Jenkins is with the delivery pipeline plugin. That's one of the main plugins that I'll use, the Cloudbees template plugin, as well as the build pipeline plugin and Cloudbees folders plugin. So the delivery pipeline plugin in Jenkins models a pipeline as a series of Jenkins jobs. And the pipeline starts with some job that you designate as the initial job in the pipeline. And then you connect these together. The remaining parts of the pipeline are composed of jobs that are connected together through their upstream or downstream dependencies. And the key thing about the delivery pipeline plugin, or one of the key things about it, is that it provides a nice visualization of the pipeline. So, jobs that might appear unrelated, we can get a nice visualization of their relationships and their role in the pipeline. The delivery pipeline plugin organizes jobs with labels that you assign to each job. So you assign a stage label and a task label where the stage acts as a container for one or more tasks. And then you connect jobs together, again, with either with some sort of dependency. And so for a job that you want to run automatically on the completion of another job, you could use the build other projects in the post-build actions. Or for a job that you want to do manually, you want to go in and execute it yourself, you would use the build other projects manual step, which is provided by the build pipeline plugin. So I want to take these tools and create a actual deployment pipeline. And I'm going to imagine that I'm working for Boardsaur.com, which is a purveyor of fine keyboards. And I need to build and deploy the first two services, the catalog service and the order service. So this company's microservices, the code is in GitHub. The code is actually a Play framework application written in Scala, built with SBT. If you're not familiar with the Scala world, SBT is kind of roughly equivalent to Maven in the Java world. And then deploy this to AWS. So my goal is that when a change happens in GitHub, that it's going to be noticed in Jenkins. We're going to have a pipeline of connected jobs. The first one's going to do the build, test, package. The next one is a manual job that deploys to a test environment, and then another manual job that deploys to a production environment. So I'll start by creating a build job. This is a good time to think about naming conventions. This was mentioned yesterday in the Jenkins 101 talk, and I think I'll emphasize it as well, that it's a good idea to have some naming conventions around your jobs. And so my naming convention is going to be that all my jobs start with the word KB store, and then a dash and whatever the service is that we're dealing with, and then another dash and the type of the job. So here I'm creating a KB store catalog build, which is a freestyle project. I need to configure the delivery pipeline label, so I'll check the delivery pipeline configuration option and give a stage name of build and a task name of compile. And that ends up looking like what you see below in the UI. You get this nice container for build, and then there can be multiple tasks inside of it based on the task name. And so this illustrates also that how the actual job appears in the UI. You get, this is a job that's completed successfully, so it's green, and it gives you some of the timing information. One of the things that I really had to come to grips with when I wanted to do continuous delivery was, how do you version the artifacts that you're creating? I have a background in the Maven Java world. I was used to the idea in Maven where you, as you're doing development, you have some version with -snapshot at the end of it, and that snapshot label stays there through multiple builds until you're ready to do a release, and then you strip off the snapshot label, do your release, and increment the version to a new snapshot version. But that's kind of antithetical to the idea of any build could potentially be a release build. So my solution to it is get rid of the snapshot. Every build is a real build. And one of the ways that I can take advantage of that idea in my build pipeline is to have a delivery pipeline version created when that first build in the pipeline runs. So I'm going to configure, in this first job, I'm going to have the delivery pipeline version option selected, and I could put in a template there. Here I'm making my template 1.0 dot build number. So I'm taking the build number from the Jenkins job execution and making it part of my version number for my software. Checking the set build display name option then will also change the appearance in the build history so that instead of just saying 20, 19, 18, it says 1.0.20. So I get a closer correlation to between what I see in Jenkins and what my software version is. Also, the generated version is exposed in a pipeline version environment variable, and it's passed as a parameter to all of the downstream jobs that we connect together. So those jobs can work on the right version of the software that we built in the first job. So one of the nice things about SBT is that any property that you set in the build definition can be generated with code. And so this piece of code I have on the screen is how I set the version number in my build definition file. Again, I have a hard-coded 1.0 here. And then if there is a build number environment variable present, I append that on to the end of the version. So I might get a 1.0.20 or 1.0.19. Or if it's not present, then it just is an empty string, so it's just 1.0. So on a development machine, it would be 1.0. On Jenkins, it will have a micro number corresponding to the actual build. My understanding is that Maven can do this sort of thing now as well, but I haven't worked with a recent enough version to know for sure. Of course, I'll want to configure SCM. I like to set my ref spec to pull exactly the branch that I want, and that'll come up a little bit later. I'll build with the SBT builder because this is an SBT project. I set all of my flags. And then my last action that I have in here, Docker::stage, is something that's provided by SBT's, an SBT plugin called SBT Native Packager. And the result I get from this is a file or a directory that contains a generated Docker file in the root, and then a opt folder that contains some scripts for launching my application and all of the jar files that I need for running the application. So there's the first jar file in the list there is my actual code that I wrote, and then all the other jar files are the dependencies that I need to run this application. And because I'm deploying to Elastic Beanstalk, I can just zip this up as a zip file, that directory that I had on the previous screen, and send that up to Elastic Beanstalk, and it will unpack it and run a Docker image for me. So my second step in the build process is just zip it up. But here you can see I'm taking advantage of the pipeline version environment variable to include that as part of the artifact name. So the build will produce both jar files, which I could upload to Bintray or Nexus or Artifactory, and zip files, which are my deployment artifacts, which I might upload to an S3 bucket. That's what I'm actually going to do. You might also, upload those to your Bintray or whatever you're putting the jars in as well. And I could use the S3 publisher for that. And then the next important step is to connect to the next job in the pipeline. And so my next step is to release to a test environment. I'm going to make this a manual step. I have to go in and execute it. And so in the post-build actions, I'll put in build other projects manual step and name the project that KB store catalog deploy int, which is my deploy to integration job. And when I have this all set up, you're going to see a connection between the build and the integration in the UI. And because it's a manual step, you'll see a little play button in the right-hand side of the job, which I can click on to actually execute that. So I need to create a deployment job because to be the downstream job. So I'm going to create a new item called KB store catalog deploy int. This slide is, this image is not quite right. This shouldn't be a job template at this point. It should be a freestyle project. Define my delivery pipeline configuration, stage name of integration, task name of deploy. Again, use the pipeline version because this was passed as a parameter from the first job into this job to retrieve the appropriate artifact or to use the appropriate artifact name in my calls to AWS to create an application version and to update the environment. And perhaps when I've done a deployment to my test environment, I'd like to trigger a load test. And if I want that to run automatically after the deployment, I could put in the post-build actions a build other projects action, which names the load test project. And I also, again, need to connect to my next pipeline job, which means I'm going to have a manual step. In the post-build actions, I'll name a manual step that calls the deploy to production job. And so at the end of all of this, we should have this set of 4 jobs, a build job, 2 deploy jobs, and a load test job. But there's no clear relationship between these jobs, just looking at them in the default list view. So now let's create a pipeline view. So we would go up on the view, click on the plus icon, and give it a name, like catalog pipeline. Make sure to select delivery pipeline view. There are some settings that you can set on the delivery pipeline. So number of pipeline instances per pipeline. Right now I have that set to 5, so that would show me the 5 most recent runs of that pipeline, essentially the 5 most recent builds. And then down at the bottom, the enable manual triggers should be checked, or I like to check that, so that I get the little play button in the pipeline UI. And enable rebuild is a recent addition, which is very nice. It gives you a, after a task has run and turns green, it gives you a little refresh button that you can click on to run that task again if for some reason you need to. And then the last thing in the view is to add some components, what the delivery pipeline calls components. So I'm going to add a component called catalog and set its initial job to the build job that I just created, KB store catalog build. And the result I get after creating that view will look like this. We have this nice connection now, this nice visualization between the jobs. And you can see on these tasks here that have run already, that thing on the right-hand side is the refresh button that lets you execute the task again. And so you can see the most recent execution, the 1.0.19, is up at the top, and then 1.0.18 is below that. And that 1.0.18 was an instance that didn't make it all the way to production. It got deployed to the test environment, but for whatever reason, we decided not to continue with it. And so that deploy to prod is not showing green. It's not even been executed. Whereas the 1.0.19 was completed all the way across. Now, if you recall, we needed to add an order service in our scenario. So, oh boy, we have to do that again. I mean, it didn't take very long for me to go through the slides, but it actually took longer than that to figure out that configuration. And more importantly, what happens when we decide we need to change the build and that change should apply to all the projects? And that's not too bad when you have like 2 projects, but what happens when you have 20 projects to deal with? It gets to be a real bear. And so that's where the template plugin comes in very handy. We're going to build another pipeline for order, which is virtually the same as the previous one. So things like the names of the jobs, the SCM repository that you're going to check out from, those are the things that change. Virtually everything else stays the same. And so the template plugin captures that sameness while letting you customize the parts that need customization. So to create a template, we would, I'm going to create something called KB store build template. And this should be a job template. The first step in building templates is to have a working job available that you want to use as your baseline. And so we just built KB store catalog build. And so when you load that, the config.xml gets loaded into the script text area. And now our job is to go in and write a little bit of code in there to customize the parts that we want customized. So what kinds of things can we do? We could customize the description. So what you do in the template is write Groovy code. So back here on this slide, my type is selected as Groovy template transformation. And so I write little snippets of Groovy code. This is very much like server-side generation of an HTML page. I write a little a little snippet of Groovy code to split out my name and get the parts based on splitting on the dashes. And then insert the service name, service part of it into the description. More, so that's nice, but more relevantly or more usefully, I can transform the URL that I'm checking out my code from, assuming that all of my code is conform, all of my repositories conform to my naming convention. And I can transform publishers. So the pipeline trigger that calls the downstream job that sets up my relationships for my downstream job, I can insert the service name in here. And as long as, again, my jobs are following the naming convention that I laid out, my template will be able to call them. You can also set attributes in a template. So these are things that you want to be able to configure when you use the template. So maybe I want to configure what branch this is going to build on rather than just hard coding to build on master. I'll build on a configurable branch. And so here I'm adding an attribute called build branch. And that ID becomes a variable that I can use in the script. So now I can change my ref spec. Instead of being hard-coded to master, I can insert build branch in there. And then to use this, I would create a job. Here I'm calling it KB store order build, and select KB store build template as the type. So that's going to, once I've created that template, it's going to show up as a new project type in my list of project types. And again, and specify my attributes. So here I'm just going to build off of the master branch. So I type that in. The name is automatically populated based on the name that was specified on the previous screen. And hit save. And we're done, and that was easy. I think you can see that if we have to create a bunch of these, that it's getting a lot easier with this template plugin. I also want to create a template for my deploy jobs. It's going to be very similar. So KB store deploy template, and I'm going to use the name to encode a environment. And then pull out of the, in my transformation code, I could pull out that fourth part and assign it to a variable called env. And then I could use that to come up with a display name. And then use the display name in the, in configuring the pipeline stage. So I know that this task is going to be deploy, but the stage could be integration or it could be production or whatever the environment I'm targeting is. And in my transformation, because I'm going to use the same template for all of my deployment jobs, I might have some logic in here that says if the target environment is int, then include the stuff that connects to the downstream jobs. Otherwise, omit that. And then to create an instance of this, I, again, create KB store order deploy int, make it a KB store deploy template type, and I should have a pipeline that looks like this created. So that's the template plugin. We might want to, and there I'm just creating all the jobs in the root, Jenkins root, the default way of creating the jobs. We might want to, though, instead of having the environment encoded into the job name, we might want to have a folder that contains the environment and contains the jobs that that are relevant to that environment. The key thing is that folders create a namespace, and so jobs in different folders can have the same name. So I could create, with the folders plugin, I could create a folder. Here I'm calling it invent. And you can do things like assign credentials to that environment, or set some environment variable that you're going to use in the deployment process that's specific to that environment. And then I'd end up with folders for each of my environments. Once I do that and move my deploy jobs into those folders, then I need to modify my build template. So instead of calling the downstream job in the root, it needs to say invent / and then the name of the job. I can also, if I'm going to extract the environment information from the folder instead of from the job name, I can do that by using the parent attribute in the job and access the display name. So the parent is the folder that contains the job, access the display name, and do my split on the name. And then adjust my logic accordingly for that. And so I'll end up with the integration has a order deploy and the prod has an order deploy. And so the fact that I can do that, it could be handy, I think, when you have more than, I'm just talking about a fixed set of environments here, but when I want to add additional environments, maybe I want to add them on the fly, being able to script it and being able to create a folder which contains the same, where each folder contains the same set of jobs becomes useful. And so you can script the creation of folders or instances of a template by calling the REST API. You can also use the scripting to, just to create however many pipelines you need to create or to be able to recreate your configuration. So you do that by calling the instantiate URL. So you use the URL of the template, KB store deploy template in this case, /instantiate, pass a name in the job parameter, and then a XML document that gives a value for each of the attributes that you've defined in the template. So I think this is a pretty good setup. It worked well for the situation that I was working in. There are a few issues. One is that, one of the things I'd like to be able to see is through my pipeline, is to see what was most recently deployed to each environment. And I could see that, right? I could see what, when the production deploy turns green, so that gives me some indication. But because of the limit, there's a limit on how many pipeline instances will be displayed, it could roll off on me. So you can increase the number of visible pipelines, but it would be nice to have a view that shows the most recent deployment by environment. I think it would be really useful if we could somehow get that into the delivery pipeline plugin. Some things about the template plugin are a little bit unexpected. One is the XML processing instruction must be first. So if you try to put some code before that, which I wouldn't have expected would affect the outcome, you get an error when you try to instantiate an instance of that template. You get a 500 error and it tells you the groovy template didn't produce well-formed XML. So Putting the processing instruction first will cause that. Putting any mistake you make in the middle of the template, which is valid groovy code, but results in a template that is not well formed, will also give you the same 500 error. This is more of a programmer error, but so here I try to access and I want to access the fourth part of the name, and if I create a job that doesn't have 4 parts in the name, I'm accessing an invalid array index. And I probably should change my code to deal with that. But again, it results in an error when you attempt to use the template. You get this 500 error that says array index out of bounds exception. But the most troubling, I guess, is that you can get silent failures. So existing jobs that you have created that are based on a template won't get updated if you make a change to the template that results in an invalid transformation. So there's no indication that something went wrong. So you have to verify, after you make changes to the template, you have to verify that the changes took effect by looking at the config.xml or creating a test job or something that indicates to you that it was successful. So it would be nice to have some sort of a test facility in the template plugin. I hope that I've given you a good overview of creating a delivery pipeline using the delivery pipeline plugin, the template plugin, and the folders plugin. And here's some links to the documentation for those plugins. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take those. Thank you.